Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome to the last seminar of semester 1. Welcome to our live audience and welcome to our online audience. Today we have a special topic by Rachel Lambert, who is landscape architect and partner at Boffa Miskell. So please make sure online folks to mute your microphones. If you have any comments or questions, please wait until the end of the talk. Feel free to write your comments, questions in the chat box, or wait until the end. You can open your mic and ask Rachel any question you may have. Rachel, the floor is yours.
Cool. And will you just jump to the slideshow now as well?
Yes, I'm in the process.
See me? So yeah, kia ora tātou. Thank you all for joining me today. And yeah, I've worked at Boffa Miskell for some 35 years now, which kind of will seem crazy to a lot of you, I'm sure, in terms of just working in one place for a very long time. But I feel quite privileged to have done that, given the range of project opportunities I've had over the years, and also the opportunity to collaborate internally. I don't know how many of you know much about Boffa Miskell, but we are a multidisciplinary practice of landscape architects, planners and ecologists mainly. And so we work together on a lot of projects as well as with external other consultants and clients. So I've certainly had I feel, a really fascinating career so far, and one that I hope to continue with. So I've got an awful lot of slides here, and so I'm going to try and rattle through them, because once you start looking, it seems like there are lots of images to put before you all. I did think, though, I would just start with a little bit of background about me and sort of how I came to be a landscape architect, I guess. So this was sort of typical family life for me growing up. I'm the youngest of 4 girls, and we are sitting there in age order. The eldest sister in the green is also a landscape architect, Sarah Collins, works also here at Boffa Miskell, and my 2 middle sisters are actually both cooks, and they work together. So there's something obviously funny about our family. But just, you know, my parental background, I think, influenced very much how I became to be a landscape architect. My father came from a rural background, although he was an electrical engineer, and my mother from an arts background. She did fine arts, but she was also a plant propagator. And so I think those things very much framed my attitude towards training as a landscape architect, which I did at Lincoln back in the day when you needed an undergraduate degree. So I did my undergraduate degree in horticulture at Lincoln, and then immediately did a postgraduate landscape architecture qualification. So, something I'm not going to talk about, but which has been a big part of my life for the last 5 and particularly couple of years, is Te Tangata Manu, and hopefully you're aware of that. It's the new guidance for landscape assessment in Aotearoa, New Zealand, in a statutory context, and hopefully later this year or next year, Gavin Lister and Alan Titchener and I will come and talk to you about that. But I guess I wanted to raise that because I think it's important that you appreciate that, you know, through practice, you continue to learn and be challenged and change and evolve your way of thinking as a landscape architect. And being involved in Te Tangata Manu for me really has been quite important in terms of particularly evolving my thinking around the Te Ao Māori perspective, and the combination of Te Ao Māori perspectives on landscape and what I'd call the more traditional Te Ao Pākehā perspective that I have originally come from. And I found that really interesting and challenging as part of this recent work that we have been doing with Te Tangata Manu. And I'm really looking forward to sort of continuing to evolve that into my practice. And I guess some of the projects that I'm going to show to you are also quite old. You know, they do range back 20 or more years, some of them, and I know that if I was approaching them today, I would probably bring another lens to them. So, you know, that's just, I guess, interesting, and it puts a perspective on some of the projects that I will talk to. So I guess when I was thinking about this, I wanted to talk to you about project work, because I think, that's a way of letting you see some of the scale of projects. So where I work as a landscape architect, I work very much at the front end of bigger scaled, multidisciplinary, relatively complex kind of projects. I often say that if things are simple, then I'm generally not needed. And so my clients, do involve me in projects that are challenging and at the front end. So projects that are needing resource consent and the broader scale master planning and concept design that goes with that planning process. I work alongside in Boffa Miskell a whole bunch of very talented landscape architects who then take projects through to detailing and delivery. And it's best from my perspective when the projects that we are working on do get delivered through Boffa Miskell's landscape architects as well. But that doesn't always happen. But certainly where I work is at that front end. So the last time I drew a detail that was something that was actually going to get built was about 30 years ago. So don't ask questions about detailed design, but certainly about the conceptualizing, the strategy for projects, and what you're looking to achieve through those projects. And I think what drives me is that whilst we have a client that has a particular outcome for a project, what we are able to do as landscape architects is weave in those other beneficial outcomes that are beneficial for the environment, but also for the communities who use places. So we're always focused on achieving those outcomes across those spectrums of opportunities, really. So earlier this year, I was flying back between Christchurch and Auckland and not taking a lot of attention to what was happening out the window of the aeroplane until I looked up and I saw this pattern in the landscape. And, immediately you're kind of drawn to this image and this landform and the crop irrigation circles, which have become such a big element in our landscape. And initially it was just a pattern to me, and then I looked at it again and I thought, well, no, I actually 100% know that place. That's a vineyard called Ara, and it's a project that I was involved in for a good 5 years, 20 odd years ago, in the establishment of a vineyard across this landscape. And that is a river terrace that's 1,600 hectares of site that was intended to be developed, the whole of the terrace, as a vineyard with a very particular type of approach. And we had a very interesting client who had a very big vision about essentially creating a new wine region within the wine region of Marlborough. And it was crazy times in many ways. There was probably quite a lot of development money around at the time in the early 2000s, sorry. And so, we were quite privileged to be working with a client who was well funded and who had a vision about creating a vineyard in a very different way. And he brought together a winemaker and viticulturalists and brand people as well, and hand-picked a team of 4 of us, 2 architects, John Coop at Warren & Marnie, Richard Priest of Hillary Priest Architects, Jess Silvalco, who was at Designworks, who is a brand and design person, and myself as a landscape architect. And the 5 of us worked together, very integrated with the overall project team for that 5 years in developing this vision of a new wine growing region. And you can see by the brand that, they set themselves high objectives, and, you can look back at it and think it was definitely crazy times in that sense. But from the landscape perspective, the scale of this beautiful river terrace captured on one side by the river, the Waipopai River, and on the other side by this beautiful tapering down hillside landscape with this big river terrace, was just an amazing canvas. And one of the other amazing things about the vineyard side of it was that the growers of the wine had a very European approach, and they were planting in a way that was very unlike a typical New Zealand approach. They did a lot of very detailed soil analysis to determine which grape rootstocks or grapes grew on the rootstocks across a very detailed pattern across the landscape. So they weren't just very linear in their approach. They were very much attuned to the underlying soils and the terroir of the very detailed river terrace soils. So we did together make some wine, and the wine people thought it was pretty good wine in those early years as well. The wine that's on the shelf today in the name of Ara is a slightly different wine, but we kind of had an amazing 5 years of establishing this new wine region, and it had this concept of essentially there is a big fault line that goes through the property, and so that lower land where the farmers was a good 4 meters below the upper terrace, and then this vineyard which was hidden in behind between the river and the backdrop of the hills. And so over this period we worked together always, the 4 of us and the wider team of Ara in terms of the winemakers and the viticulturalists. And this is early drawings from Warren and Mani around the first hub of infrastructure, so where all the tractors and the staff would be focused. And so this shows a building that is buried into the landform and creates a sheltered internal courtyard for that worker space, and all of the things that were associated with a large workforce within the viticultural landscape. And just the sections showing that building really as part of its landscape, and then the site for that building within the new landscape of the vineyard. And you can see in this vineyard that there are lines that don't follow the grid, that they follow an organic pattern. And that was the pattern that was responding to this underlying soil typologies and the way the grapes were then grown. The different varietals were grown on a very fine mosaic in this vineyard, not like the bigger industrial scaled grid. And there, at the end of the day, this building took on a slightly different form, but there it is, pre-formed landscape, commonly known as DART because of its shape, as a building for the first sort of piece of infrastructure. One of our key jobs in this project, alongside working on the master planning and the architectural concepts, was to develop a manual for the landscape, to set up the principles for all of the management of the landscape across the site. And there was a strong biodiversity focus around that, particularly around these 2 species. Tui, because they're very territorial, we were attracting them to be territorial and to chase away the birds that vineyards don't want. And then Ara was one of the early places too to set up a New Zealand falconry to also be part of the vineyard biodiversity. And so the vineyard had 2 grape varietals, mainly 2 wines we produced, Pinot Noir and the Sauvignon Blanc that Marlborough is so well known for. And the way the soils worked across the site meant that the Pinot grapes were distributed towards the hill slope and the Sauvignon grapes were distributed towards the river terrace. And that structured an approach to the overall landscape design across the whole of the site, and gave us a palette where we graded the plant materials to respond either to the warm colours of the Pinot or the cold colours of Sauvignon, and to work that into the wider landscape. So here, what was known as the Pinot stream, the stream that flowed across the landscape naturally from the slopes, but also diverted from a large water storage dam that you can just see in the top of this picture, to run across the landscape. Here it is in construction, and again, unlike many vineyards, this vineyard did relate to that organic flow and sinuous qualities, as well as the gridded lines of the grapes. And then those palettes that related to those Pinot opportunities, and weaving those plant species, native indigenous plant species, into the vineyard. So this image really just helps again to show the scale of this project at the time. There was a big natural wetland at that right-hand end of this drawing. And that was part of the wider diversity enhancement and concepts behind the project. And that was on the lower land below the fault. But on this upper terrace, you can see those circles. They are the distance that the smoko huts, so the people working within the vineyard landscape, would walk back to where they would have their smoko. And so you can see the scale of this site in terms of just how many smoko huts, the distance of those, and also that organic naturalized response to the underlying soils of the way the vineyard lines are set out. And, it was typical of this project that, everything was developed around delivering on this coordinated ethic around brand, design, and the creation of this essentially new principality, as it was known, around the ARA label. And that meant that, nothing went unthought of in terms of how it was delivered. And that included the way the smoko hut shelters themselves were designed. So here's Hilary Priest's design for these shelters. They essentially were places of refuge, not internalized huts, because the workers would stay in their work clothes, but they were a destinational place where shelter was available, and where all of the breaks that people would take during their workaday, and that the sort of flag identity, so that you could read across the landscape where your closest smoko hut was. And so you can see now again in this aerial how most of the vineyards laid out across this landscape just follow a regular grid in two directions. But this area here, and hopefully you can see my cursor, you can see the dart and the organic pattern of lines of those vineyard layout, the Pinot Lake and stream, and the scale of the vineyard that was planted as part of the ARA concept that we were involved in. And I guess, sadly, like many of these things, times changed. The GFC came along, the money ran out, and so did the project, and the site was sold. And inevitably that does happen with a lot of projects. But I think, when I was flying back over this and saw it, I know that that landscape, has evolved and changed in a way that really was responding to its site, and that aspiration to make wine in a different way within the Marlborough region. So then just jumping to somewhere totally different, and I'll need to keep moving quickly along. So those of you who know Auckland will know that this is I'm standing in One Tree Hill Domain, looking up to the summit of Mangakiekia and the obelisk that is built in memory of Sir John Logan Campbell, who gifted Cornwall Park, which is just immediately over the rise, adjacent to the people of Auckland more than 100 years ago. And Boffa Miskell has been very privileged to work for the Cornwall Park Trust Board, well, since before I worked at Boffa Miskell. Frank Boffa and Boyden Evans and Ron Fluck worked for the Cornwall Park Trust Board in those earlier days. And since I've been in Auckland, I have undertaken work for the Trust Board as their landscape architect. The original plan for Cornwall Park was designed by an American landscape architect from San Francisco, Austin Strong, in 1901, 1902. This plan was never fully implemented, but Sir John commissioned him to do a master plan for the park. And many of the design features of the park today are drawn from this original master plan. And this is the landscape of Cornwall Park at that time, the early establishment of Grand Drive in Cornwall Park. You can see there from standing on Mangakiekia, looking across, a very much uninhabited rural landscape, very unlike the Auckland of today. One of the things that people don't necessarily understand about Cornwall Park is that it is run by the Trust Board. It's fully funded by the Trust Board. There's no public money that goes into the management of Cornwall Park. And the pink coloured land in this image is the endowment land that Sir John set aside to mean that the park is funded through the income off those endowment lands. So when the Trust Board then came to say, we've been 100 years as a park in Auckland, and Auckland is changing, and we want to set a new vision for the next 100 years, they did what Sir John had done, and they went globally to say, we want to find a landscape architect to work alongside local landscape architects, Boffa Miskell ourselves, to look to this long-term vision. And luckily for us, they selected Nelson Bird Waltz, so Thomas Waltz. I don't know if any of you know Thomas or have heard him speak, but he is an amazing orator. And Nelson Bird Waltz as a practice, if you don't know them, you should Google them. They're doing beautiful, beautiful work across America and in other parts of New Zealand, Orongo Station as well. So we had the great opportunity to work with Nelson Bird Waltz on the master plan for Cornwall Park over a period of about 3 years. And this is the redrawn new master plan for the park, which in many ways looks similar, but in many ways is also very different in terms of looking to a long-term future. So, we started back at the beginning with this project of meeting, in this case, with Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei, so Malcolm Johnson, and spending a lot of time with Malcolm and retracing not only steps on Mangakiakia and within Cornwall Park, but across the volcanic landscape of Tamaki Makaurau as a whole, to understand the place of this landscape in the wider landscape of Auckland. But also looking to some of the other history of the park. It was an American military hospital during the Second World War, so that has had a big impact on the nature of the park. And it also, here shown in yellow and red, gives us a footprint of places within the park that have been heavily modified, as opposed to those that are much more intact in terms of their archaeology and their cultural, their Maori cultural landscape. So allowing us an opportunity to focus on those areas in terms of change. And one of the things that we did as part of this project was something called, the Americans call a bioblitz, but really to look at the ecology of the park and to see the opportunities for enhancement around biodiversity and ecology, and working with our own ecologists to put the park in its wider regional landscape context. And the park is at a scale where it's really important to connect west and east. So in the west there, you can see the big green area of the Waitakere Ranges Forest, and across in the east, Hauraki Gulf Islands, Rangitoto, but also Tiritirimātangi and the other islands which are important bird refuges. So the park actually forms an important stepping stone in that context within the regional and city landscape of Auckland because of its scale. And one of the things we were really seeking to do, and using kaka as our sort of signatory species, was to develop the habitat of the park to provide more service in that regional context for the avian bird life, so for birds across the regional landscape, and to provide a real destination between those east and west locations for kaka, but then also the other species within the park, both birds, but also, the insect life, and looking also at the predator strategies, because the park is a great destination for a lot of pest species as well. One of the things the ecologists discovered is a novel ecology, which is where contemporary land practices really establish a new form of ecology. And here, the grazing by sheep and the exposing of the rock lava flows in the paddocks sets up an amazing habitat for the copper skink, which is a threatened species, and a great taonga to mana whenua as well. So here we discovered that actually there's a really strong population of copper skink in the park, and that is a combination of the grazing by sheep, the exposed rock shelf geology in those paddocks, and also the rock walls in the park. So we've got strategies about evolving that and enhancing the habitat for the copper skink in that combination of the rock walls. And here a diagram from the master plan that's really talking about that opportunity to connect the skink habitat across the site, but also to bring people more connected to that ecology, and to align our pest management strategies with protecting the copper skink as well. So one of the things also about just such a long-term vision is that the park is clearly known for its amazing tree stock. Many of those trees are reaching 100 years of age. Some will grow a lot longer, but one of the things we did was track the age and the sort of establishment period, the mature period, and looking into these yellow bars, the senescent phase for trees within the park. And particularly with global warming, this is becoming a much bigger factor for the park, that if we want trees of stature for 100 years' time, we actually need a strategy about replanting now so that those trees will be there in 100 years, because many of the trees that are growing in the park now, given our predictions around temperature and climate change and the involvement of the arborists, is that those trees will need to be replaced. So one of the things that having that long-term value, that long-term vision of 100 years, does enable you to make some bolder decisions around quite substantial replanting across the park, and in fact removal of trees as well. And so we developed strategies for the revegetation or the replanting, the replacement planting of the key structural alleles and planting areas within the park, so that that sequence of vegetation will be retained. One of the other sort of things that happens incrementally to these places over time is that, we've been a very car-driven society, and now, thankfully, we're turning away from that. There are 500 car parks right in the core of the park at the moment. And so the master plan addresses the sequential removal of those parks, the migration of car parking to the outside edges of the park, and giving the park back to pedestrians. And in doing that, looking at other forms of autonomous vehicle, again, because we've got that long-term vision. This isn't pie in the sky. Google, and there are trials with autonomous vehicles already in parks that we are looking to institute. And one of the things that was great about COVID, not many great things, but the gates to Cornwall Park were shut, and that meant that cars no longer went through, and pedestrians have reclaimed a lot of the park, so it's making that conversation for us a lot easier about transforming to a non-car based destination within the heart of the park. And then just again, long-term vision, or I guess something slightly more hairy and audacious and expensive, but looking at that opportunity to reconnect pedestrians across the big divide that Green Lane East creates between the two halves of the park, with some form of future land bridge. So that's a project that hopefully I'll be still alive to see happen. But just capping on, we have now progressively also with Nelson Birdwaltz started the first of the works of implementation of the master plan. So you can see here around the perimeter of the anti-park, if you like, the entrance to the park and the way it was designed. This was something that Austin Strong had envisaged, an anti-park. The trams used to arrive here on Manukau Road and deliver pedestrians into the park at this point. So this is the front arrival gate, if you like, to the park. It's been redeveloped. The poplar trees, the Lombardy poplar trees were removed from here. We needed resource consent to remove magnolia trees from the front of the park as well. The Lombardy poplars had rust and they did need to be replaced, and so now we have an allele of 3 species of native trees around that crescent of Campbell Crescent, the statue of Sir John Logan Campbell central to that, and a new path network that actually enables people to cross in all directions, and swathed native planting as part of the frontage. So, a really great first stage of implementation of works. And today we're in a project which is replacing the nursery, because the park grows a lot of its own plant material. So then just switching gears a little bit, I live in Auckland, and a lot of the work that we are involved in an Auckland context is around Auckland's growth. The population growth is a big challenge for Auckland, and Auckland Council has been planning for growth in a satellite sense, both to the south of Auckland, so in this Pukekohe, Pairata, Drury area, and then also to the north in Warkworth. So in about 2003, we were requested to get and look at a project that was about some greenfield growth in Pairata. And one of the good things about this part of greenfield growth is that it's an opportunity to create a sister city or town to Pukekohe, which is also growing itself, to retain a greenbelt separation, and then on the basis of a train station that will be part of the commuter rail, that when CRL, which is Auckland's new connected rail system, which is better for commuter rail time tabling, when that comes into play, this new town will have a rail station to support it in terms of commuting, where that needs to be back to Auckland. A lot of the southern growth means there's also a lot of employment in the south. So in fact, people don't need to move back into Auckland for work. And so when we were initially looking at whether we would agree to take this project on, because that's an important step that we need to make in terms of, are we able to support particularly a greenfield growth type of project? Auckland has a vision. That vision is primarily around intensifying within the established city area. So that's the priority, brownfield intensification. So this is greenfield growth in an area that is planned strategically for Auckland City to be growing. But we looked at, if you like, a sort of the key initiatives around Auckland's vision for growth in that left-hand column, and to see whether, in fact, Pairata North would be able to deliver on those objectives as a way of helping us to determine whether we could support it, but then also to help the landowner, was the Wesley College, who are obviously about providing schooling to underprivileged boys in particular. And so this project is about enabling them to have a long-term sustainable future in terms of schooling in Auckland, and South Auckland in particular. And so we were looking at, can we support it? And then how do we support the Wesley College to promote this plan change process to go from rural land to urban land to enable this greenfield growth? And so I guess just reiterating that the project was able to deliver on the city's vision for growth. And particularly the other thing that's not on that list, but that was fundamental to us, is that this land is not first-class soils, so not those prime soils that Pukekohe is well known for. And that was another reason why we could support undertaking this work. So the site itself, it's 306 hectares, so I think 8,000-ish dwellings in the long term. And just to help everybody understand scale at the time, this is the footprint of Hobsonville, which is a brownfield, the old Air Force growth area that is in northwest Auckland, up in the Waitakere old area of Auckland. And so just using that to help people understand the scale of the project and the nature of the housing opportunity of this site. The rail station opportunity is positioned down here. And then just some very high level diagramming. So my key involvement in this project was at that plan change stage. So the plan change is looking at seeking a change of zoning from the rural zones into urban zones to enable urban residential development to happen. So a lot of our work at this stage is quite high level. We did more detailed roading layout plans as well, but this is just a diagram from some of those earlier times. And then again, looking today, this Pirata North, or it's actually, it was branded by the client as Pirata Rise, which to me, I guess, feels more like a suburb than a town, and this will be a new town. But you can see that development underway, and particularly the green open space corridors of the riparian network, which is a fundamental component to the overall structuring of the master plan that we developed for that plan change phase. And also you can see they've secured a school with the Ministry of Education, which is an important part of this greenfield growth to create new communities that are actually a community in this place, rather than needing to travel to have those kind of whole of the, you will have heard the term the 15-minute city, so that walkable city where you do have, you've got rail access, you've got schools, and you've got commercial areas to support everyday life within this local community. And that's what Pirata Rise is evolving to develop and to deliver as part of Auckland's southern growth. And our ecologists and landscape architects are continuing to work at that more detailed level on this project. So just jumping to a much more urban plan change, and so this is a brownfield residential plan change that we've worked on much more recently in partnership with Architectus, who are architects that we work with quite frequently. This is a site that's close to the Albany town centre, and it's, or actually Albany is a metropolitan centre, so that's the largest scale of centres within the Auckland hierarchy below the city centre itself. This land is land that the Albany campus of Massey University currently or owned, but no longer requires, given its more intensive form of development itself. And so our client has purchased it as a brownfield site for redevelopment. And it's got amazing amenity opportunities for residential development at a higher density with this adjacent protected bush escarpment adjoining the site, and also the Lucas Creek off to the left there. So, you know, plenty of amenity in terms of increasing in density. And just, you know, as a scale of site, you know, it's clearly up there alongside some of the bigger redevelopment sites across Auckland as well. I think one of the things that's really interesting, and I come up against a lot, is that people are very resistant to change, but they forget how recently things have actually changed. So this is a sequence of drawings, just looking at the site from 1940, which is quite a long time ago, but right through to 1996, so almost the 2000s, so only 20 years ago, this land was transitioning from rural into urban. And so, you know, present day, we're seeking to change from a suburban type of activity on this site to one that's much more urban, so incorporating up to 10-storey apartment development. And, you know, when we're consulting with the community, those residents are talking as if the suburban environment is all that's ever existed there. So that when you put this context of landscape change to people and remind them that, in fact, you know, over the last, 60 years, this site was rural right through until when Albany itself, only about 20 years ago, started to really develop. You can see that actually that continued change does make sense, and it makes sense in the context of Auckland's aspiration for compact growth. So I'm just going to whip through a few images here. One of the things that you do when you do this sort of plan change work is that you need to do a lot of contextual mapping about the site and how it does connect to the wider area. So this is particularly looking around existing bus routes and connectivity through to the Albany town metropolitan centre, which is the main destination, and the busway connection back to the Northwestern motorway that will connect people back to the central city. One of the other things that is increasingly important for all of us, and I think I forecast that in the beginning, is just the engagement process with Auckland's mana whenua as part of that early stage, and understanding the values that are important to them, the development of principles of how we will develop the site, and those sort of high-level objectives. And then there's much drawing and redrawing of the site to test ideas, to develop principles around how the master plan will work and will frame up development sites, and then coming through to an overall master plan that informs the plan change and the nature of development within it, and how taller height development can in the future be accommodated whilst protecting adjoining residential neighbours as well. So we were also involved at this master plan level in developing the open space strategy, so the strategy for the street networks, but also the combination of open space across the site as a whole. There's a corridor along the existing stream with the backdrop of the vegetated escarpment here, a park as the heart of the whole community, and a tributary waterway that is protected as part of that open space connectivity. And so as part of that master planning, there is a level of testing of the nature of the concept design of those spaces, and then how the overall development may look in time, given that you're forecasting out what will happen in the future. So I think I can't really talk about my life as a landscape architect without touching very briefly on the blueprint for Christchurch post the earthquakes in 2011. You know, we were very fortunate as part of a multidisciplinary team with RCP and Warren Amani to be selected to undertake the blueprint, which was really looking about the positioning of a series of anchor projects to help the regeneration of Aotearoa Christchurch after the earthquakes. And my role in that project team, and again, it was one that brought together Don Miskell, Mark Bailey and I as sort of senior people within Boffa Miskell to work. We had a very brief time frame, about 60 days, to look at developing this structured master plan. And one of the things we did was look back to the original black map for the Christchurch city plan. And you'll know Hagley Park is off here and forms an important part of the city's framework. But originally there was an actual town belt right around the city. And one of the moves we made was to, with the east frame, to contain what was too large a city centre by the introduction of the east frame, and also the south frame, which was more of a campus style development. And my specific role within the Blueprint project was Te Papa o Tākaro, which was the open space project along the Avon River. And I think, you know, you'll all know that there have been many landscape architects involved now in the delivery of the vision of the really focusing of the city onto Aotearoa, the river, and that has created a whole series of spaces. This is work by Land Lab, and must acknowledge that, but also WSP, as well as our own Boffa Miskell landscape architects, have been involved alongside many others. But, you know, I think, you know, I feel that the refocusing of the city in this way has been great, not only for people, but also for the ecology of the river and its habitat values, and really enriched the nature of the city that I knew well and grew up in, and perhaps the river wasn't so much of a focus of the urban cityscape. So something else that I have been very involved in for many years, since the 2000s, again, starting with a master plan and a plan change, is the Wynyard Quarter down on Auckland's waterfront. In the time that I have worked on this project, the government agency that has had control of the Wynyard Quarter has gone through 4 restructurings. So in the beginning, when we were doing the master plan and the plan change, it was Auckland Regional Holdings. It became C+ City. It then became Waterfront Auckland, and it's now Ehi Panuku Development Auckland. And I think one of the things that is really great when you can stay involved and provide continuity over the people who come and go from projects. And I'm part of a design review tag where 4 of us have been involved right from the beginning. So in many ways we hold the sort of the design integrity of the project, whilst sort of others have come and gone over time. So again, working with Architectus originally with the master plan, they led the master plan, and there are 3 key axes that inform the spatial planning for the Wynyard Quarter. You can see here the green axis, which connects a future headland park, Te Aru Tukutuku, with Victoria Park in the south. And this again is work by Landlab in delivering that. And I think it's really satisfying when you can see and be involved in a project from over a long period of time and see those original design structuring ideas of a master plan delivered and then really create the heart of a new community. Again, Landlab's work with Amy Dauldy Park, one of the small common parks for the new residents within the urban area of Wynyard Quarter. And this is the diagram that set the heights. And so this was a key component of my original work with the plan change, supporting the heights that were proposed across the site. And that includes buildings up to 52 metres with the purple there. And then seeing that delivered and a new community in this urban heart of the city develop. So I'm rattling through and I'm getting towards the end, which is good. And hopefully we'll have sort of 5 minutes at the end for some questions. I just thought it was also good. Obviously, over so many years, you get involved in thousands and thousands of projects, and they're not all as big as the ones that I've talked to you about. This is a much smaller project, but one which is really dear to my heart because it has created a new little coastal community of residents who really are very connected as a little community. They have many weekend barbecues, evening, summer barbecues, and they're really integrating. This is Snells Beach into this community. The architect is Crossan Architects. Obviously one of the things you'll be thinking about is sea level rise, and working with Jim Darm as a coastal processes engineer on the recreation of the dune landforms and the setting of the floor levels. Now, trustfully, if we don't exceed the sea level rise anticipated, this community will be there for at least another 50 to 100 years. And I guess like so much of Auckland and the whole of New Zealand by then. And that's a challenge that I think is a great one for us all, a difficult one, but one that will be requiring many landscape architect skills in the future around the issues around retreat of coastal communities. But here this is designed to meet sea level rise requirements, but just a little project that really tucks itself in and has created a great community in this part of Snells Beach. The other thing I just wanted to say to you before the end, and I guess I'm kind of seeking to talk mainly here to the students amongst you, is that I think a lot of what you do as a landscape architect and the projects you manage to get involved in and the way you collaborate with others is about you as a person and the way you approach the work that you do and the work that others do and how you can contribute to that together. So I think it's also important to be involved in a wider sense across your communities and to make those people connections, not only within the community that you live in, but in the community of colleagues across the other disciplines and professions. And I think in many ways, some of the opportunities that I've had as a landscape architect are because people seek me out to work with, because whilst I'm very strong in my own views and advocate strongly for landscape and for communities and for the environment, I'm also really interested in achieving, working collaboratively with people in a way that, secures great outcomes across the whole of the project. And, I think that's important to me. And so this is just a little touching on a little conversation that says, you know, when I came to Auckland, and I'd grown up all my life in Christchurch, but I wanted to escape, came to Auckland and, you know, got involved in where I was living, which was Ponsonby, and that's where I still live. And within that community, you know, there was a lot of change happening and people were uncertain as to whether that change was a good thing. And the community got together at that time and developed its own like district plan, essentially. So it was a very collaborative process within the community, and we took that district plan proposition to council. Of course, they largely ignored it, but what was important to me is that you know, it really connected me into a new community that I didn't know, and I got to know a lot of people who are still important to me in my life in Auckland, and did really ground me in the place that I now choose to live. So I think that's something that's important to think about in terms of just how you connect with the place that you do live in. And then the other thing that I have done as part of a sort of aligned but voluntary thing in the last, well, for 4 seasons of Sculpture in the Gardens, which are located in the regional botanic gardens here in Manurewa in Auckland, I've been a curator for the Sculpture in the Gardens. And that's really given me an amazing opportunity, not only to connect with the garden staff and to know what they're doing, and Jack Hobbs, who runs the gardens, but also to connect with the community of artists and sculptors across, well, not only Auckland, but Aotearoa, because we every 2 years invite proposals. There are 20 works selected as part of the exhibition. We generally receive around 80 proposals, so there's quite a selection process. This is one of the selections from the last exhibition that I was involved in. So the Sculpture in the Gardens, when it was set up, the curatorial panel has always had 3 people on it, and one of those people has always been a landscape architect. So originally Leo Ju was the landscape architect, then myself, and then for the last show, Catherine Hamilton was involved in that role, because I felt after four rounds that was enough. So we're involved in that selection process. We then cite all of the works as part of the selection and refinement, so that there's this interrelationship between the botanic gardens and the placement of sculpture within the park over a 3-month period for the exhibition. And then we work alongside the sculptors in refining the positioning, confirming that they're happy with that selection, and then work also with the structural engineers around the implementation of the works. And it's really been an amazing opportunity for me to connect with a different part of the creative community across Auckland and Aotearoa. And I think this is just the 3 of us, the curatorial panel of the last round. So sculptor Brett Graham, who's an incredibly talented sculptor, well known and respected. His father was also a sculptor, and Linda Tyler, who is works at the University of Auckland and is very well connected into the arts community. And one funny little sideline, I guess, moment of conversation right at the end of this talk is that we discovered in about our second year of or second show that Linda and I are actually twins. We were born on the same day in the same year, but didn't know each other until we became curators side by side for the gardens and sculpture. So that's been an incidental little additional nice thing to have discovered a twin in the process of something that I've really enjoyed as a sideline to my work as a landscape architect. And this, just as a finishing slide, and I'll let you jump back to seeing me in a second, is a work by Jamie Pinkenell in one of the shows, and I like it as a work. So that's the end. Do you want to jump back? And I'm happy if anybody has a question. Sorry, I've probably really rattled through that. So hopefully it's made sense to you all.
Thank you. Thank you, Rachel. Any questions from